We didn't just sink ships, we sank their will to fight. Every torpedo that left our tubes was another nail in the coffin of the Japanese Empire, another thread cut from the lifeline that kept their war machine breathing. I'm Lieutenant Commander Jack Morrison, and for 3 years aboard the USS Wahoo and later the USS Tang, I watched the Pacific Ocean become a graveyard for Japan's merchant fleet. By war's end, we'd sent over 80% of their cargo ships to the bottom, starving an empire into submission one convoy at a time. The periscope broke the surface of the South China Sea like a steel needle piercing black silk. It was March 1943, and I was serving as executive officer aboard the U.S. Wahoo under the legendary Captain Dudley "Mush" Morton. The submarine's hull creaked softly around us as we maintained depth at 60 feet, our diesel engine silent, running on battery power alone. In the control room, red lights cast everything in an otherworldly glow, and the only sounds were the gentle hum of electric motors and the occasional whisper of compressed air. "Bearing mark," Morton called softly into the periscope earpiece. 270 degrees, replied Chief Quartermaster Frank Springer, his voice barely above a whisper. Through the periscope, Morton was tracking what our intelligence reports had promised: a Japanese convoy steaming southwest toward the Philippines, loaded with oil, rice, ammunition, and the 1,000 other necessities that kept the empire of the rising sun fighting. 3 cargo ships, maybe 4, escorted by at least 2 destroyers. It was exactly the kind of target that Admiral Charles Lockwood's submarine force had been unleashed to hunt. Contact bearing 270. Range 4,000 yards, Morton announced, his voice carrying that particular blend of excitement and cold calculation that made him the most successful submarine captain in the Pacific. "Looks like 3 Marus and 2 Tinkins. Gentlemen, we're going to make some widows today." The word Marus was submariner slang for Japanese merchant vessels, derived from the suffix that appeared in most of their names. But these weren't just ships to us. They were the arteries through which Japan's war machine pumped its lifeblood. Every ton of fuel oil we sent to the bottom was fuel that wouldn't reach a Japanese carrier. Every cargo hold full of rice we split open meant hunger in the home islands. Every transport we torpedoed was fewer reinforcements reaching the desperate garrisons scattered across the Pacific. "All ahead 1/3, Morton ordered. "Come to periscope depth. Set up for a submerged attack." I felt the familiar surge of adrenaline as the Wahoo began her approach. We'd been on patrol for 31 days, prowling the shipping lanes between the Dutch East Indies and the Philippines. This was our first real chance at a convoy since leaving Pearl Harbor, and every man aboard knew what was at stake. The Japanese Empire was an island nation, cut off from the resources of Southeast Asia, and it would strangle itself. "Torpedo room, this is the captain," Morton spoke into the intercom. "Stand by forward tubes 1 through 4. We're going to put these fish right where they'll do the most good." From the forward torpedo room came Chief Torpedoman's mate, Roger Payne's voice. "Forward room ready, Captain." Fish are hot, straight, and normal. The setup took 43 minutes. Morton maneuvered the Wahoo into perfect position, using every trick he'd learned in 2 years of combat patrols. The Japanese convoy maintained course and speed, their lookouts scanning the horizon for aircraft, but never suspecting that death was rising from beneath their keels. "Range 1,500 yards and closing," I called out, watching the TDC, the torpedo data computer, calculate firing solutions. "Convoy speed 12 knots, zigzag pattern Charlie." "Beautiful," Morton murmured, his eye pressed to stethoscope. "They're lined up like ducks in a shooting gallery." "Forward tubes 1 and 2, target the lead transport. Tubes 3 and 4, target the second ship." The silence in the control room was absolute except for the soft whir of the TDC's mechanical brain and the gentle rush of water against our hull. Every man held his breath. This was the moment when all our training, all our preparation, came down to 4 Mark XIV torpedoes and the skill of one man at the periscope. "Fire 1, the submarine shuddered slightly as the first torpedo left its tube, a bubble of compressed air marking its departure. 21 inches of steel packed with 643 pounds of torpex, explosive raced through the water at 46 knots, its wake invisible beneath the surface. Fire 2. Fire 3. Fire 4. 4 torpedoes in the water, each one carrying enough explosive power to break the back of a 10,000-ton cargo ship. Morton kept his eye pressed to the periscope, tracking their progress while I watched the stopwatch and calculated impact times. 1 minute, 20 seconds to impact, I announced. The waiting was always the worst part. Once the torpedoes were in the water, there was nothing to do but watch and hope that the Mark XIV's notorious problems, premature explosions, circular runs, and magnetic-influence exploders that failed to detonate, wouldn't rob us of our kill. 1 minute, 40 seconds. "Come on, you beautiful fish," Chief Payne muttered from his position near the torpedo room intercom. "Swim straight and true." Then the first explosion lit up the periscope like a camera flash. Even 60 feet underwater, the concussion hammered against our hull with a sound like God's own thunder. Morton whooped with savage joy as the lead transport, a 7,000-ton cargo vessel laden with aviation fuel, erupted in a pillar of flame that climbed 500 feet into the Pacific sky. "Direct hit on the lead ship," Morton called out. "She's burning like a torch." The second explosion came 18 seconds later, and the third followed so closely that they seemed to merge into one continuous roar. Through the periscope, Morton watched 2 more cargo ships break apart under the hammer blows of our Mark XIVs, their hulls splitting open like ripe fruit to spill precious cargo into the sea. 3 hits out of 4 shots, Morton announced, spinning the periscope to check for the escorts. 2 ships down, 1 burning and listing heavily. "The destroyers are coming around. They look mad as wet cats." "Take her deep," I ordered. "All ahead flank. Rig for depth charge attack." The Wahoo dove like a stone, her ballast tanks flooding as we sought the safety of deep water. Above us, we could hear the thrash of destroyer screws as the Japanese escorts raced toward our last known position, their sonar pinging desperately through the water like electronic bloodhounds seeking our scent. At 200 feet, we leveled off and went silent. Every non-essential system was shut down, every man frozen at his station. The only sounds were the gentle hum of our electric motors and the distant rumbling burning ships above us. Chief Electrician's mate James Buckley moved through the boat like a ghost, checking battery levels and motor temperatures, knowing that our lives depended on the stored power in our massive X-side batteries. The first depth charges began falling at 13:47 hours. Even at 200 feet, they hit us like sledgehammer blows, each explosion sending shock waves through the water that made our steel hull ring like a giant bell. Light bulbs shattered, cork insulation rained down from the overhead, and every gauge on the boat jumped and vibrated, whispered Seaman First Class Tony Romano, a 19-year-old kid from Brooklyn who was on his first war patrol. "How close was that one?" "Close enough," I replied, trying to keep my voice steady for the crew's sake. But privately, I knew we were in for a rough time. The Japanese destroyers had gotten a good fix on us, and their captains were skilled, experienced men who knew how to conduct a depth charge attack. For the next 2 hours, they tried to kill us. 97 depth charges fell around the Wahoo, each one a 600-pound canister of TNT designed to crush our pressure hull like an eggshell. At one point, they came so close that the lights went out completely, and we drifted in absolute darkness while Chief Buckley and his electricians worked frantically to restore power. "Hull integrity holding," reported Chief of the boat William Thomas, a 20-year Navy veteran whose calm voice was an anchor of stability in the chaos. "Minor leaks in the forward battery compartment, but the pumps are handling them." Finally, as the sun began to set on the South China Sea, the destroyer sounds faded into the distance. The Japanese had given up their hunt, returning to pick up survivors from the 3 cargo ships we'd sent to the bottom. When we finally surfaced at 2,130 hours, the ocean was empty except for scattered debris and a thin slick of oil that stretched to the horizon. Secure from depth charge stations, Morton ordered over the 1MC. "Well done, gentlemen." 3 confirmed sinkings, approximately 25,000 tons of enemy shipping sent to Davy Jones' locker. As I stood on the bridge next to Captain Morton, breathing the clean Pacific air and watching the stars emerge in the darkening sky, I couldn't help but think about what we'd accomplished. 3 ships didn't seem like much in the grand scheme of the war, but I was beginning to understand that this was how Japan would be defeated, not in some climactic battle, but by the slow strangulation of their supply lines. Every ship we sank was one less to carry oil from the Dutch East Indies, one less to transport rice from Burma, one less to ferry troops and ammunition to their island fortresses. "Jack," Morton said quietly, his voice carrying a note of grim satisfaction, "we're not just fighting ships and planes out here. We're fighting an entire empire's ability to wage war. And we're winning." By the summer of 1943, the pattern was established. American submarines prowled the Pacific in coordinated wolf packs, strangling Japan's merchant marine with methodical precision. I'd been transferred to the USS Tang under Commander Richard O'Kane, Morton's former executive officer and one of the most aggressive submarine commanders in the Pacific Fleet. The Tang was a brand-new Godot-class boat, 312 feet of steel death-armed with 10 torpedo tubes and 24 Mark XIV torpedoes. We were part of a coordinated campaign that Admiral Lockwood called Operation Stranglehold. Though that wasn't its official name, it captured the strategy perfectly. Intelligence intercepts revealed Japanese shipping schedules, and our submarines were positioned like chess pieces across the Pacific, each boat assigned to specific patrol areas where enemy convoys were most vulnerable. "Contact bearing 090. Range 6,000 yards," called out Lieutenant Larry Savitkin, our radar operator, his voice cutting through the pre-dawn darkness of the bridge. "Multiple contacts. Looks like a big one, sir." It was August 24, 1943, and we were patrolling the Formosa Strait, the narrow body of water between Taiwan and mainland China. Intelligence had warned us to expect a major convoy, the largest of the war so far, carrying supplies to Japanese forces in Philippines and Dutch East Indies. What we found exceeded even our most optimistic expectations. Through binoculars, I counted 19 cargo ships arranged in 4 columns, escorted by 8 destroyers and 2 escort carriers. It was a floating city of steel, carrying everything from aviation fuel to artillery shells, from medical supplies to replacement aircraft for the carrier forces in the Central Pacific. "Mother of God," O'Kane breathed beside me. "That's got to be 200,000 tons of shipping, if we can get in among them." "Captain," came the voice off Lieutenant Commander Frank Springer over the intercom. "Torpedo room reports all tubes loaded and ready. We've got a full spread available." O'Kane's plan was audacious even by submarine standards. Instead of the traditional approach, fire a spread of torpedoes and dive, he intended to attack from the surface, using the Tang's superior speed and maneuverability to dart between the convoy columns like a destroyer, firing spreads at point-blank range before the escorts could react. "All ahead flank," O'Kane ordered. "Close to 2,000 yards and prepare for surface attack. All hands to battle stations." The general alarm echoed through the Tang, and within seconds the boat was alive with purposeful activity. In the forward torpedo room, Chief Torpedoman's mate Bill Leibold and his crew made final preparations on our Mark XIVs, each torpedo a precision weapon worth more than most men made in a year. In the engine room, Chief Machinist's mate Frank Briggs coaxed every ounce of speed from our diesel engines, the Tang knifing through the calm seas at 21 knots. At 0347 hours, we penetrated the convoy's outer screen. The Japanese destroyers were focused outward, watching for submarine periscopes in the water rather than a surface attack from inside their formation. It was a tactical blindness that O'Kane exploited with ruthless efficiency. "Target bearing 045. Range 1,800 yards," I called out from the bridge, tracking the largest cargo ship in the convoy, a 12,000-ton transport loaded so heavily with supplies that her plimsoll line was barely visible above the waterline. "Set," replied Lieutenant Mel Enos from the torpedo data computer. "Solution ready. Fire 1. Fire 2. Fire 3. 3 torpedoes raced toward their target, while O'Kane swung the Tang hard to port, lining up on a second cargo ship. The first explosion came 96 seconds later, a brilliant flash that lit up the entire convoy, followed by a secondary explosion as the transport's cargo of aviation fuel ignited. "Direct hit," I shouted. "She's breaking up." But there was no time to celebrate. O'Kane had already lined up our second target, a 9,000-ton freighter loaded with ammunition for the garrison at Rabaul. Fire 4. Fire 5. Fire 6. The Tang shuddered as 3 more torpedoes left their tubes, and O'Kane immediately ordered hard right rudder to bring us onto a third target. Around us, the Japanese convoy was dissolving into chaos. Ships scattered in all directions while their escorts raced frantically through the formation, searchlights probing the darkness and 5-inch guns firing wildly at shadows. The second target died spectacularly, her ammunition cargo detonating in a series of explosions that sent debris raining down across 2 miles of ocean. The shock wave was so powerful that it knocked 2 men off their feet on our bridge and cracked windows in the conning tower, muttered Chief of the boat Hayes truck, watching the mushroom cloud of smoke and flame climb into the pre-dawn sky. She must have been carrying enough ammo to supply a whole division. O'Kane's surface attack continued for another 47 minutes, the Tang weaving through the convoy formation like a ghost ship, firing spreads of torpedoes at ranges so close that we could see individual sailors on the enemy ships' decks. By the time the sun rose on August 24th, we had fired 22 torpedoes and scored 17 hits, sinking 11 cargo ships and damaging 3 more so severely that they had to be abandoned. As we finally dove to escape the inevitable depth charge attack, I tallied our night's work. 97,000 tons of enemy shipping destroyed, including 2 transports carrying aircraft engines, 1 tanker loaded with diesel fuel, and a cargo ship packed with medical supplies bound for Japanese hospitals in the Philippines. But the numbers only told part of the story. Skipper, reported Chief Radio Man Jesse De Silva, "We're picking up Japanese radio traffic. Sounds like they're calling for every available escort in the area." O'Kane nodded grimly. "They know what we've done to them." That convoy was probably carrying a month's worth of supplies for their Central Pacific operations. Without those ships, their garrisons are going to start feeling the pinch within a few weeks. As we settled into our patrol depth and began the long wait for the depth charges to stop falling, I found myself thinking about the larger picture. The 11 ships we'd sunk that night weren't just statistics. They represented thousands of tons of irreplaceable materials that would never reach Japanese forces. The aviation fuel we'd sent to the bottom meant fewer aircraft in the skies over the Solomon Islands. The ammunition we'd destroyed meant Japanese defenders would have fewer shells to fire at American Marines when they stormed the next island fortress. The depth charge attack that followed was the most intense I'd ever experienced. For 6 hours, Japanese destroyers and patrol craft hammered us with over 200 depth charges, each explosion a thunderclap that threatened to split our hull like kindling. At one point, we lost power completely and drifted helplessly at 180 feet while Chief Electrician's mate John Sandy and his team worked in absolute darkness to restore our electrical systems. "Hull strain gauge showing yellow," reported Chief Truck, his voice tight with concern. "We're taking a beating, but she's holding together." When we finally surfaced that evening, the ocean was empty except for scattered wreckage and oil slicks that stretched to the horizon. In his patrol report, O'Kane would write, "Destroyed 11 enemy vessels totaling 97,000 tons. Enemy convoy completely dispersed, mission aborted. Estimates severe impact on Japanese supply operations in Central Pacific Theater." But the real impact went far beyond tonnage figures. Each sinking created a ripple effect that spread throughout the Japanese war economy. Shipyards that should have been building warships were pressed into service, repairing damaged merchants. Escort vessels that could have been protecting aircraft carriers were tied up shepherding remaining cargo ships. Most critically, the loss of trained merchant seamen, men who took years to replace, was slowly bleeding Japan's maritime capability dry. "You know what the most important thing we sank tonight was?" O'Kane asked me as we stood on the bridge, watching the last of the debris fields disappear behind us. "The tanker?" I guessed. "The rice ship," he replied. "That 7,000-ton freighter loaded with grain from Indochina. When the home islands start rationing rice, the Japanese people are going to understand that they're losing this war." By early 1944, the submarine campaign had evolved into something far more systematic and devastating than anything the Germans had achieved in the Atlantic. I was now serving as executive officer aboard the USS Flasher, one of the most successful submarines in the Pacific Fleet, under Captain Reuben Whitaker. Our patrol area was the South China Sea, the vital waterway through which Japan's lifeline to the conquered territories of Southeast Asia flowed like blood through an artery. The statistics were becoming undeniable. In 1943, American submarines had sunk 335 Japanese merchant vessels totaling 1.5 million tons. But 1944 was shaping up to be even more devastating. Improved radar, better torpedoes, and coordinated wolf pack tactics were turning the Pacific into a hunting ground where Japanese merchant ships ventured only at their extreme peril. Contact report from Growler, reported Lieutenant Bob Gibson, our communications officer, as he handed me the decoded message. Large convoy departing Singapore, course 045, speed 14 knots. Estimated 20-plus merchants with heavy escort. We were part of a 3-submarine wolf pack called Whitaker's Wolves, coordinating our attacks with the USS Growler and USS Pompanito. The convoy that Growler had spotted was one of the largest to attempt the run from Singapore to Japan since the beginning of the year. A desperate effort to get raw materials to the home islands before the American advance in the Central Pacific cut the shipping lanes completely. Plot the intercept course, Whitaker ordered. Signal Growler and Pompanito. We'll take position here. He pointed to a spot on the chart where the convoy's most likely route passed through a narrow channel between two reef formations. Classic ambush position. For 36 hours, we maneuvered into position while the convoy steamed toward us at a steady 14 knots. Intelligence reports indicated that this was more than just another supply run. The convoy included several tankers carrying aviation fuel from the refineries at Palembang, cargo ships loaded with rubber and tin from Malaya, and at least 2 transports packed with replacement aircraft engines desperately needed by Japanese air units in the Philippines. Radar contact bearing 270. Range 12,000 yards, called out Chief Radarman Jim Lynch. Multiple contacts, count estimate 26 ships with escorts. Through our periscope, the convoy looked like a steel metropolis moving across the water. 4 columns of merchant ships, each column protected by destroyers and corvettes, with a 5th column of tankers in the center under especially heavy guard. At the convoy's head and flanks, additional destroyers swept back and forth in search patterns, their sonar pinging constantly through the water. This is what we've been waiting for, Whitaker said quietly as he studied the formation through the periscope. Intelligence estimates this convoy is carrying 40% of Japan's monthly petroleum imports from the Dutch East Indies. The attack began at 14:23 hours on March 12, 1944. Growler fired the first spread, her torpedoes striking 2 tankers in the convoy's center column. The explosions were visible from 12 miles away, twin pillars of flame that climbed 1,000 feet into the tropical sky as 20,000 tons of aviation fuel turned the South China Sea into an inferno. Growler's gotten into them, I reported, watching the massive fireballs through our periscope. 2 tankers burning, looks like there'll be total losses. Whitaker waited until the escort destroyers had committed themselves to hunting Growler before making our own attack. The flasher closed to 2,800 yards and fired a spread of 6 torpedoes at a cluster of cargo ships that had broken formation in the confusion following Growler's attack. Fire 1 through 6, Whitaker ordered. Target the big freighter, then the 2 transports behind her. Our first torpedo struck the lead freighter, a 9,000-ton cargo ship loaded with tin ingots from Malayan mines, just forward of her bridge. The explosion opened her hull like a can opener, and she began settling by the bow almost immediately. The second and third torpedoes found the transport behind her, a vessel we later learned was carrying 147 replacement Zero fighters bound for airfields in the Philippines. 2 definite hits, I reported. The freighter's going down fast, and the transport is listing heavily to port. But the real prize was still ahead of us. As the convoy formation disintegrated under our attack, a single tanker broke away from the main body and headed south at flank speed, escorted by 2 destroyers. Through our periscope, I could see she was riding low in the water, fully loaded with precious petroleum products. That's our target, Whitaker announced. A fully loaded tanker is worth 3 cargo ships. Take her down, and we've cost them a week's worth of fuel imports. The chase lasted 4 hours. The tanker, we later identified her as the Nippon Maru, a 12,000-ton vessel carrying aviation fuel and lubricants, maintained 18 knots while her escorts laid down a barrier of depth charges designed to keep us submerged. But Whitaker was patient, using the flasher's superior underwater speed to gradually close the range. At 1847 hours, as the sun began to set over the South China Sea, we finally got our shot. The tanker had slowed to navigate a coral reef, and her escorts had moved ahead to check for submarine contacts. It was the opportunity Whitaker had been waiting for. Range 2,000 yards and closing, I called out from the periscope. Target bearing 090, speed 12 knots. Set, replied Chief Torpedoman's mate Dutch Schoenrich. Solution ready. Fire 7. Fire 8. Fire 9. 3 Mark XIV torpedoes raced toward the Nippon Maru at a range so close that impact was almost guaranteed. The first torpedo struck her amidships, directly beneath her cargo holds full of aviation fuel. The explosion was unlike anything I'd ever seen, a brilliant white flash that momentarily blinded me, followed by a fireball that climbed 2,000 feet into the evening sky, whispered Quartermaster Third Class Mike Fennell, one of the youngest men on our crew. Look at her burn. The Nippon Maru didn't sink, she disintegrated. The second and third torpedoes arrived while she was still in the throes of her initial explosion, adding their destructive power to a conflagration that could be seen from 50 miles away. When the smoke finally cleared, there was nothing left but a spreading slick of burning fuel oil and scattered debris. Scratch one tanker, Whitaker announced over the 1MC. Gentlemen, we've just sent 12,000 tons of aviation fuel to the bottom. That's enough fuel to have kept an entire air group flying for 2 months. By the time our wolf pack finished with the convoy, 22 of the original 26 merchant ships had been sunk or damaged beyond repair. The 4 survivors, all damaged and riding light after jettisoning their cargoes, limped back towards Singapore under heavy escort. It was the most devastating single defeat ever inflicted on a Japanese convoy, and the strategist implications were enormous. Signal from Sank, reported Lieutenant Gibson, handing me the decoded message. Admiral Nimitz sends his congratulations. Intelligence estimates today's action will delay Japanese offensive operations in the Central Pacific by at least 6 weeks. As we patrolled through the debris field that evening, I was struck by the scale of destruction. Floating wreckage stretched for miles in every direction. Cargo containers, life rafts, fuel drums, pieces of superstructure. Here and there, oil-soaked survivors clung to debris. And despite our orders to avoid contact with enemy personnel, Whitaker authorized the dropping of life rafts and medical supplies. They're sailors. Same as us, he explained when Chief of the boat Paul Matthews questioned his decision. This isn't about killing Japanese. It's about sinking their ships and stopping their supplies. That distinction was important because by 1944, the submarine campaign had transcended simple warfare and become something approaching economic strangulation. Each ship we sank represented not just tonnage lost, but critical materials that would never reach Japanese factories, fuel that would never power their aircraft, food that would never feed their soldiers. The Japanese Empire was slowly starving to death, and American submarines were cutting its throat one convoy at a time. The year 1944 marked the beginning of the end for Japan's merchant marine. By summer, the submarine blockade had become so effective that Japanese convoys were forced to hug the coastlines, hoping that shallow water and land-based air cover might provide some protection from the wolf packs that roamed the deep ocean with impunity. I was now commanding officer of the USS Barb, having been promoted after 18 months as executive officer aboard the Flasher. The Barb was a veteran Gato-class boat with 12 war patrols under her belt, and my crew were seasoned professionals who had learned to read the ocean's moods and exploit every weakness in Japanese convoy tactics. Captain to the conning tower, came the call over the intercom. It was July 8, 1944, and we were patrolling the Yellow Sea approaches to the home islands, the final choke point through which Japan's dwindling supply convoys had to pass. Lieutenant Commander Bob McNitt, my executive officer, handed me the periscope as I entered the cramped conning tower. Sir, we've got what looks like the remnants of a convoy about 8 miles northeast. Count shows 6 merchants and at least 4 escorts, but they're moving in single file instead of formation. Through the periscope, I could see the truth of what the submarine campaign had accomplished. Instead of the massive, well-organized convoys we'd hunted in 1943, this was a ragged collection of survivors, cargo ships and tankers that showed clear signs of previous damage, patched and repaired, but still seaworthy enough to attempt one more run to the home islands. "They're running scared," observed Chief of the Boat William Walker, a 23-year Navy veteran who had served on submarines since before the war. "Look at that spacing. They're so spread out that they can't provide mutual support." It was true. The convoy was strung out over 5 miles, each ship maintaining maximum distance from its neighbors in the hope that a submarine attack on one vessel wouldn't spread to the others. It was a defensive tactic born of desperation, and it made them even more vulnerable to systematic attack. "Plot and intercept course," I ordered. "We'll take them from the rear, one at a time." Signal the engine room, all ahead 2/3. The Barb moved through the water like a predator, her diesel engines purring as we closed the distance to the convoy's trailing elements. My plan was simple: attack the rear ship first, then work forward through the convoy before the escorts could organize an effective response. "First target is a medium freighter, probably about 8,000 tons, I announced, studying the vessel through our periscope. "She's riding high, so either she's in ballast or carrying lightweight cargo. Could be empty, heading home for another load," suggested Lieutenant Paul Saunders, our torpedo data computer operator. "A lot of these ships are making the run in ballast now, just trying to get back to loading ports." The thought was sobering. If we were seeing empty ships trying to get back to Southeast Asia for cargo, it meant the supply situation was even worse than our intelligence estimates suggested. Japan was so desperate for raw materials that they were risking their few remaining merchant ships on what amounted to suicide runs. "Range 4,000 yards and closing," I called out. "Stand by forward tubes 1 and 2. The attack was almost anticlimactic. 2 torpedoes fired at close range, both hits amidships, and the freighter broke in half and sank within 4 minutes. There was no time for lifeboats, no opportunity for the crew to abandon ship. She simply folded up like a closing book and disappeared beneath the yellow sea, taking her entire crew with her. "Target destroyed," I reported to the crew over the 1MC. Moving to second target. The second ship, a small tanker of perhaps 5,000 tons, died just as quickly. 1 torpedo in her engine room, a massive explosion as her fuel cargo ignited, and she was gone in a pillar of flame that served as a funeral pyre for both ship and crew. By this point, the convoy's escorts had finally reacted to our presence. 2 destroyers came racing back toward us, their sonar pinging frantically through the water while they drop-a-depth charges in a pattern designed to force us away from the remaining merchants. "Take her deep," I ordered. 200 feet and rig for silent running. For the next 3 hours, we played a deadly game of cat and mouse with the Japanese destroyers. Depth charges fell around us like rain, each explosion a hammer blow that tested our hull and our nerves. But the Japanese were operating at the end of a very long logistical chain themselves. Their sonar was obsolescent, their depth charges were running low, and their crews were exhausted from months of convoy duty. When we finally surfaced that evening, the ocean was empty except for debris and oil slicks. The remaining convoy ships had scattered, each one racing for the nearest port, while the destroyers continued their futile search for us in the wrong patch of ocean. 2 confirmed sinkings, I announced to the crew, 13,000 tons of enemy shipping destroyed, and 4 more vessels forced to abort their mission. But Lieutenant Commander McNitt was studying the intelligence reports that had come in during our submerged evasion. "Skipper," he said quietly, "according to these intercepts, that convoy was one of only 3 that attempted the run from Singapore this month. Last year at this time, they were running 20-plus convoys monthly on this route. The implications were staggering. Japanese merchant shipping had been reduced to a trickle, and even that trickle was being systematically eliminated by American submarines. Raw materials weren't reaching Japanese factories, fuel wasn't reaching their military forces, and food wasn't reaching their civilian population. "How many submarines do we have operating in Japanese waters now?" I asked. 47 boats on patrol as of this morning," McNitt replied, "plus another 18 in refit or transit. Singpak is calling it the Strangulation Campaign." As we headed home to Pearl Harbor after 58 days in patrol, I reflected on what we'd accomplished. The Barb had sunk 14 ships totaling 96,000 tons during this patrol alone, But the real victory wasn't measured in tonnage. It was measured in Japan's inability to supply its war machine. By late 1944, the Japanese Empire was running on fumes, and American submarines were ensuring that even those fumes wouldn't last much longer. By the winter of 1944, the submarine blockade had achieved what surface fleets and strategic bombing had failed to accomplish: the systematic destruction of Japan's ability to wage war. I was back at Pearl Harbor for a brief rest between patrols, attending briefings that revealed the true scope of what our underwater navy had achieved. Gentlemen, Admiral Charles Lockwood addressed the assembled submarine commanders in the basement auditorium of the submarine base. I want you to understand what you've accomplished. In the past 18 months, you've sunk over 4 million tons of Japanese merchant shipping. That represents approximately 75% of their pre-war merchant marine. The statistics were breathtaking, but Admiral Lockwood wasn't finished. Intelligence reports indicate that Japan's petroleum imports have fallen to 12% of their 1941 levels. Raw material imports are down 86%. Food imports from their conquered territories have virtually ceased. Captain Eugene Fluckey, commanding officer of the USS Barb and one of the most aggressive submarine commanders in the Pacific, raised his hand. Admiral, what about new construction? Are they replacing the ships we're sinking? That's the beauty of it, Gene, Lockwood replied with a thin smile. They can't. Japanese shipyards have built exactly 47 new merchant vessels this year. You gentlemen have sunk over 800. They're not just losing the war, they're losing the ability to fight the war. The briefing continued with detailed intelligence reports that painted a picture of an empire in its death throes. Steel production in Japan had fallen to 30% of peak levels due to lack of iron ore from Malaya and the Philippines. Aircraft production had dropped 60% because aluminum shipments from the Dutch East Indies had been cut to almost nothing. Most critically, the Japanese civilian population was beginning to starve as rice imports from Indochina and Burma disappeared into the depths of the Pacific. What you're seeing, continued Captain Richard Voge, Lockwood's operations officer, is the collapse of an industrial empire that was built on the assumption of secure sea lanes. Every torpedo you fired has been a nail in the coffin of Japanese militarism. I thought about my upcoming patrol aboard the Barb. We were scheduled to operate in the Sea of Japan itself, the body of water between the Japanese home islands and the Asian mainland that the Japanese had considered their private lake since 1905. New intelligence indicated that the few remaining Japanese convoys were attempting to use these supposedly safe waters for coastal runs between the home islands and Korea. Operation Barney, Admiral Lockwood announced, referring to our upcoming mission, will involve 9 submarines penetrating the Sea of Japan through the Tsushima Strait. Intelligence suggests the Japanese have concentrated their remaining merchant shipping in these waters, believing them to be safe from submarine attack. The plan was audacious. The Tsushima Strait was heavily mined and patrolled, with underwater detection nets and destroyer barriers designed to prevent exactly what we were planning. But by June 1945, the Japanese were so short of fuel that their patrol vessels operated on reduced schedules, and their mine barriers had gaps that could be exploited by submarines with accurate charts and skilled navigators. Operation Barney began on June 4, 1945. 9 American submarines, Barb, Bowfin, Tunny, Skate, Flying Fish, Tenosa, Spadefish, Sea Dog, and Creval, approached the Tsushima Strait in the pre-dawn darkness, each boat navigating independently through the minefields and detection nets that protected Japan's inner sea. The Barb went through the strait at periscope depth, following a narrow channel that intelligence had identified between 2 minefields. Chief of the boat, William Walker, plotted our course with the precision of a surgeon, knowing that a navigation error of even 50 yards could send us into a minefield or trigger one of the underwater detection nets. Death under keel. 42 feet, reported Chief Quartermaster Robert Boyd, his voice barely above a whisper. Current setting us north about half a knot. Through the periscope, I could see the dark bulk of Tsushima Island to our starboard, its rocky coastline topped with radar installations and searchlight batteries. Japanese patrol boats moved back and forth across the strait's entrance, but their patterns were predictable, and we slipped between them like a ghost. Clear off strait, I announced at 0347 hours. We're in the Sea of Japan. For the next 3 weeks, the 9 submarines of Operation Barney turned Japan's inner sea into a hunting ground. The Japanese had indeed concentrated their remaining merchant shipping in these waters, believing them safe from American attack. What they found instead was a wolf pack operating in their backyard with devastating effectiveness. The Barb's first kill came on June 8th, a small coastal freighter carrying coal from Korea to the steel mills of northern Honshu. She was unescorted and unsuspecting, steaming at a leisurely 8 knots when our torpedo broke her back and sent her to the bottom in less than 3 minutes. "Target destroyed," I announced to the crew. But that's just the beginning, gentlemen. Intelligence reports indicate there are over 50 merchant vessels operating in the Sea of Japan. We're going to sink everyone we can find. The hunting was unlike anything we'd experienced in the open Pacific. Ships appeared almost daily, most of them unescorted or traveling with minimal protection. By June 15th, the Barb had sunk 8 vessels totaling 42,000 tons, including 2 precious tankers carrying fuel oil from refineries in Manchuria. But the most significant encounter came on June 18th, when we intercepted a convoy of 12 cargo ships and 5 escorts attempting to carry industrial equipment from Korea to factories in Japan. These weren't just supply ships, they were carrying the machinery and raw materials that represented Japan's last hope of maintaining industrial production. "This is it," I told my officers as we planned the attack. "This convoy represents months of accumulated supplies that they've been hoarding for a final push. If we can destroy it, we'll have cut one of their last remaining arteries." The attack took place in broad daylight, the Barb using her surface speed to race along the convoy's flank while firing spreads of torpedoes at maximum range. In 43 minutes, we fired 18 torpedoes and scored 14 hits, sinking 9 cargo ships and damaging 2 more so severely that they had to be abandoned. 9 confirmed sinkings, I announced over the 1MC as we dove to avoid the inevitable depth charge attack. 56,000 tons of enemy shipping destroyed, including at least 3 vessels carrying industrial machinery. But the real measure of our success wasn't tonnage, it was the complete disruption of Japan's remaining supply network. By the end of June, Japanese radio traffic intercepted by our intelligence services showed clear signs of panic. Convoy schedules had been abandoned, cargo ships were refusing to leave port, and the few vessels that did venture out were traveling singly at night, hugging the coastline in desperate attempts to avoid our submarines. "Signal from Sinkpack," reported Chief Radioman James Lynch, handing me the decoded message. "Operation Barney results. 27 enemy vessels sunk, 4 damaged beyond repair. Total tonnage destroyed, 142,000 tons. Admiral Nimitz sends congratulations to all hands." As we prepared to exit the Sea of Japan through the La Perouse Strait north of Hokkaido, I reflected on what we'd accomplished. In 3 weeks, 9 American submarines had effectively eliminated Japan's last secure shipping route. The empire that had once controlled the Western Pacific from the Aleutians to Australia was now unable to move supplies safely within sight of its own coastline. By August 1945, the submarine blockade had achieved total victory. Japan's merchant marine, once the 3rd largest in the world, had been reduced to a handful of damaged vessels that rarely ventured beyond coastal waters. The great empire that had launched the attack on Pearl Harbor was now starving for lack of the raw materials that had fueled its expansion. I was aboard the USS Segundo as executive officer when we received the news that would end the Pacific War. We were patrolling off the coast of Honshu, part of a coordinated effort to intercept any remaining Japanese shipping, when the radio message arrived that changed everything. "Flash message from Sinkpack," announced Lieutenant Ted Swain, our communications officer. "Atomic bombs dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Japanese government considering surrender terms." The news spread through the boat in minutes, and the reaction was mixed. Relief that fewer might soon be overcompeted with a strange sense of anticlimax. We had spent 3.5 years methodically destroying Japan's ability to wage war, and now it seemed that 2 bombs had accomplished what our thousands of torpedoes had been working toward. "Captain," I said to Commander James Lynch, our commanding officer, "what do you think this means for the submarine campaign?" Lynch was quiet for a long moment, studying the intelligence reports that had accumulated over the past months. "Jack," he finally replied, "I think those atomic bombs were just the final blow. We'd already cut Japan's throat. We'd just been waiting for them to bleed to death. The statistics supported this assessment. By August 1945, American submarines had sunk 1,314 Japanese merchant vessels, totaling 5.3 million tons, 81% of Japan's entire merchant marine. The submarine blockade had reduced Japan's imports to less than 10% of their pre-war levels, creating shortages so severe that the Japanese economy was in complete collapse. Look at these intelligence summaries. Lynch continued, spreading the documents across the wardroom table. Steel production down 90%. Aircraft production down 85%. The Japanese civilian population on starvation rations. They weren't surrendering because of the atomic bombs. They were surrendering because they no longer had the industrial capacity to continue fighting. On August 15, 1945, Emperor Hirohito announced Japan's surrender in a radio broadcast that crackled with static as it reached our submarine through the boat's radio equipment. The war was over, but the final accounting of what the submarine campaign had achieved was still being compiled by intelligence analysts back at Pearl Harbor. Final tally. Admiral Lockwood announced to the assembled submarine commanders at the war's end. American submarines sank 1,314 enemy merchant vessels, totaling 5,320,094 tons. Additionally, we sank 214 enemy warships, including 1 battleship, 8 aircraft carriers, and 11 cruisers. We lost 52 submarines and 3,506 officers and men. The human cost had been significant. Submarines had the highest casualty rate of any service branch in the U.S. Navy, with 22% of submariners who went on patrol never returning. But the strategic impact had been decisive. Japan's merchant marine losses represented not just ships and cargo, but the complete collapse of the logistics network that had sustained their empire. 60 years later, I still wake up sometimes to the sound of torpedo tubes flooding, the gentle hiss of compressed air that preceded each launch off our Mark XIV fish. The submarine campaign in the Pacific was not the glamorous aerial combat that filled the newsreels, nor was it the dramatic amphibious assaults that captured public attention. It was a slow, methodical strangulation that took place beneath the waves, largely invisible to the world above. We didn't just sink ships. We sank an empire's ability to sustain itself. Every cargo vessel that went to the bottom carried with it not just tons of steel and machinery, but Japan's hopes of continuing the war. By 1945, the home islands were starving, their factories were silent for lack of raw materials, and their military forces were reduced to a hollow shell that could no longer project power beyond their own coastline. The atomic bombs that ended the war were undoubtedly terrible weapons, but they struck an enemy that had already been defeated by the silent service, the submarine force that had spent 3.5 years cutting Japan's lifelines 1 torpedo at a time. When the emperor announced surrender, he cited not just the new weapons that threatened Japan's cities, but the war situation that had not necessarily developed to Japan's advantage, a diplomatic way of acknowledging that its empire was dying of starvation. I think often about the men who didn't come home, the 3,506 submariners who rest forever beneath the Pacific in 52 boats that never surfaced. They died in the most isolated form of warfare imaginable, hundreds of feet underwater where no one could hear their final battle or witness their sacrifice. But their contribution to victory was immeasurable. They had throttled an empire and helped end the most devastating war in human history. The Japanese merchant marine that we destroyed had been built over decades, a fleet of modern cargo ships and tankers that represented billions of dollars in investment and thousands of trained seamen. In less than 4 years, American submarines had reduced it to scattered wreckage on the Pacific floor. Japan lost more than ships. They lost the maritime expertise, the trained crews, and the industrial capacity to replace what had been destroyed. When I visit the submarine memorial at Pearl Harbor today, I'm struck by how few people understand what really won the Pacific War. They remember the great carrier battles, the island-hopping campaigns, the atomic bombs that forced surrender. But that decisive factor was simpler and more brutal. An island nation cannot survive when its supply lines are cut. We accomplished something that no submarine force in history had ever achieved: the complete economic strangulation of a major industrial power. The German U-boats had damaged British shipping but never came close to severing Britain's lifelines. Our submarines didn't just damage Japan's merchant marine. We destroyed it so thoroughly that the Japanese empire starved to death. In the end, that was our silent victory. We didn't just sink their ships, we sank their will to fight, their ability to continue the war, and ultimately their empire itself. Every torpedo that left our tubes carried with it the promise that aggression would be met with systematic, methodical destruction. By war's end, we had kept that promise completely. The Pacific Ocean became Japan's graveyard not through one climactic battle, but through thousands of individual encounters in which American submarines hunted down Japanese merchant vessels with ruthless efficiency. We turned their ocean highways into killing fields, their supply routes into death traps, and their merchant marine into underwater museums. That is the legacy of the silent service in World War II, a complete, devastating victory achieved not through dramatic gestures, but through the patient application of superior technology, training, and tactics. We proved that modern warfare is ultimately about logistics, and we severed Japan's logistics so completely that surrender became their only option. We didn't just sink ships, we sank their empire. And we did it one torpedo at a time.